Hello, everyone. This is Aran. I'm an educator of philosophy based in Austin, Texas. Today, I'm with my dear friend, Tren. Hello, Tren.
Hi everybody, this is your friend Chen. I'm a cultural historian of early medieval Europe and late medieval China. I'm also based in Austin, Texas, United States of America. Good to be with you all.
Good to be with you too. So today we're going to continue our discussion on Hegel's Reason in History, which is the um, uh, introduction to the lectures on world history. And in the last episode, we talked about what we thought was the main um, engine of Hegel's understanding of history and relation between history and philosophy, and that's the concept of human nature. Although reason in history does not start with a elaborate discussion of human nature, the whole discussion that unfolds in reason in history is contingent about that conception of humanity. And it is also interesting to notice that Hegel does not see it necessary to start the conversation with the question of human nature. And I think that is important in how he understands the nature of the question there. Now, what we are going to do today is we're going to delve into the relationship between history and philosophy in um, Hegel's approach, and also start speaking of history proper and see what is the element of history, what are the how history functions based on Hegel's views, and how this all will get related to who is part of the history proper or philosophically relevant history, who is in it, and also what it means to think about history as having some sort of an end, some sort of a goal. We're going to cover all of those ideas. Trent, do you have anything about the intro?
I will just carry on. Yeah.
All right, cool. So the relationship between history and philosophy is probably the main reason that we have been interested in Hegel, and it is interesting to see how um, in this book and in other books Hegel understands the relationship between the two. I think it's good to think about how other thinkers think about this difference and or relationship, and how relevant they see history for philosophical purposes, and put Hegel somewhere there. And then in our critical remarks, we're going to see that we wonder if there is um, a Hegelian critique of Hegel, or something that is even putting the connection between history and philosophy in a way that it's much more robust and dialectically active. In Hegel, what happens with history and what really happens in terms of like the philosophical relevance of history, because this is also worth mentioning, because Hegel spent some time describing this, that of course you can do historical analysis in all sorts of ways, and I don't think there's anything in Hegel that thinks that there is any problem with like thinking about history of a specific period, history of a specific activity in humanity, history of technology. Like all those matter and are interesting. But what Hegel is concerned about is what is the philosophically relevant aspect of history, right? Like where does history become philosophically relevant? And every thinker, I think, in the history of philosophy would think that there's somewhere that the kind of intellectual activity gets related to historical progress of humanity. But the way that that relationship is understood in a lot of those thinkers is not going to be it's not going to be exactly what Hegel thinks. Like think about Kant, for instance, right? We talked last time that Hegel is very much interested in baptizing self-conscious agency as the essence of humanity, right? And kind of like finding that as a central point of his argument, which is very similar to Kant. Right? Kant also thinks that self-conscious agency is the central feature of humanity, and something like morality for Kant becomes nothing but satisfaction of self-conscious agency in practical matters. Right? Morality for Kant is when you have the right answer to the question of why you act the way you act. And that just means you're not only acting based on random impulses that you have, you're acting based on what makes sense, right? And of course, I don't think Kant would have disagreed that this point itself is something that could be better communicated in one society as opposed to another society, or even the thought of that was historically dependent on a lot of things, and even like it's a matter of even more immediate stuff about like having food first and to start thinking through this concept, enlightenment, renaissance, all of that. I don't think Kant would have been against assuming those as necessary conditions for his thinking. But I think that the part that is different in the relationship that Kant has with society and history, as opposed to Hegel, is that Kant thinks that this is the moral theory, this is the moral standard that is just correct. This is just correct. You can go to Afghanistan now, and this must be your standard. This must be the way that you assess things. And this was through in medieval times as well. But whether they followed it or did not follow it, that's a different matter. The standard itself is just like kind of like independent from any of those interactions. Also, you can turn self-conscious agency into a reality anywhere, anytime you want. How? You follow the moral structure, right? You follow the moral code. So if you're thrown into Mongolia and you're sitting there, you can make your self-conscious agency into an absolute reality by just acting morally. You act morally, you act based on having the sufficient reasons, you act based on the standard that the categorical imperative gives you, you're cool, you're done, right? And I think that's the part that is the most important part that for Hegel becomes a problem. Number one, Hegel thinks that this whole idea of what self-conscious agency is itself is something that requires a lot of historical developments to be articulated. And not only that, the full expression of self-conscious agency in the reality of someone's life is far from just having a moral code and just following that moral code. Not at all. The fact of self-conscious agency is not enough to make it real. What makes it real is actually very complicated, historically developing sociopolitical institutions, right? So if self-conscious agency is human nature, what even that means itself is a matter of possibilities of communication that political and social institutions in a given historical time will offer. So understanding what that means itself is going to be deficient in some historical periods as opposed to others because of like a specific presuppositions they have about the world. But also the reality of self-conscious agency becoming something concrete and actual is a historical achievement. And it only makes sense within a sociopolitical structure, right? That just means that the Hegel's disagreement with Kant will be that the full articulation of human agency is not solely a matter of individualized reflection and action based on that reflection. It's about living in a space. And every social space is what it is because of what it has been. Like it has been a continuity of changes and stability that made it into what it is. What doesn't change, in my eyes, between Kant and Hegel is to think about self-conscious agency as human nature, as something that is central to human nature. And Hegel might think that arriving at that idea itself as a historical achievement and the actualization of the in itself of humanity, the potential of humanity as self-conscious agency is dependent on sociopolitical structures, and those social political structures are historically constituted. But the point about human agency, I don't think it changes. Of course, Hegel's conception of subjectivity itself is going to have embedded in it more social elements. And of course, that's going to be different. So their articulation of what it means to be a self-conscious agent is going to be very different in some ways. But the idea that there is a human nature, no empirical fact will change that human nature, and that human nature constitutes a hierarchy, and that human nature constitutes an ought, all remains the same. Thinking of that common core as self-conscious agency. Now, one last thing that I'm going to say about this, it's important to realize that the ought that happens here in Hegel is very different from ought in Kant. So an ought in Kant is an active ought, meaning that you can go to Mongolia and have this standard of how one should act as a correct one, and presenting as the ought that now Mongolians need to live up to that, right? For Hegel, this is not a plausible idea because Mongolians may be in a very different historical point in which no external standard of that kind will make any sense unless there are certain political, sociopolitical institutions to support that. And creation of sociopolitical institutions itself is dependent of all sorts of social habits and customs and rituals, and very importantly, religion, that it's impossible to go with a code and try to fix people, right? And he even mentions this in Philosophy of Right about the relation between Napoleon and Spain, that when Napoleon invaded Spain and conquered Spain, he just went ahead and gave them a constitution, as if constitutions can function a priori. But Hegel's criticism of that act is that it's just an absolute oblivion about how societies work. And you cannot really go ahead and kind of extract an ought and apply it to a society without understanding what that society, the flow of the institutions of a society, how it works. However, with all of this, I think there is a clear, the fact that Hegel does not recognize the same type of an ought doesn't amount to incommensurability of different social spaces, meaning that there is something about post-Enlightenment modern Europe, about the achievement of that society, that because it is representative of a more concrete version of human agency, it is better. Historically speaking, there is still a standard. So Hegel definitely does not arrive at the conclusion that just because there is no ought that could be thrown at Mongolians, then the fact of the difference between Mongolia and Germany is just a fact of difference. No, there is a hierarchy. And in his analysis of the universal history, we're going to see this hierarchy. The whole world history, as he writes, and you can see it on this screen, he says this is how we should understand world history, which presents us with the work of the spirit and its progressive recognition of its own nature and its application of its knowledge to all the values and spheres which are affected by it. And this self-knowledge of the spirit, which we are going to talk about shortly, it's this idea of turning the potential of humanity, human subjectivity, into something actual, and making it actual as something that actually is a better thing, as opposed to a society that is not articulated enough when it comes to human nature. Trent?
Yes. I have three minor points, and some of which my anticipate we'll discuss in their critical remarks. But first of all, I very much enjoy listening to your comparison between Hegel and Kant with regard to the transportability of art. Can you like throw Napoleonic code at the Spaniards, or like bring, I don't know, liberal democracy to Mongolia, whatever. What the first thing I want to say is that with regard to first quote is it seems quite clear to Hegel that he knows what to look for when examining historical data, that there is a kind of assumed natural unit of world history, namely what he calls a state. A state here, I think, I haven't read all Hegelian literature out there, but I think here does not mean a state as we use the term in our time. In academic English, the best way for me to translate it would perhaps be a spiritual community, or community where the world spirit and the individual passions, whatever, could configurate. And but within this unit, there are certain interdependent holism, that the whole thing makes sense, that there are certain rationalized process going on. So if say Imperial China is one such state or spiritual unit, then most of the things that there exist to serve a specific purpose for this specific like nation to express its like spirit together. And this connects this assumed unit of world history connects with the second point I want to talk about is what you said, but I'll rephrase in this way. It is the intranslatability of specific cultural symbols, or maybe even national spirit, that you cannot just introduce a document that encapsulates the Enlightenment idea and throw it to, say, certain country where like no social institution is at place. And Hegel probably haven't really read his lectures that are on religion, but I guess that he would say the presence of Buddhist symbols or like a practice in China still are used in line with the Chinese spirit instead of like truly the Indian or Buddhist spirit, the host and receiving cultures, that because of the natural units that are state in itself, you cannot just extrapolate a specific element from one such state and transplant it into a different state and still cause it a manifestation of the origin state, but rather it's like redefined, repurposed, deployed to serve the purpose of the second or receiving state. So which is very much in line with a lot of cultural historians out there in our time who consider, for instance, Chinese Buddhism has little to do with Buddhism proper with capital B, but rather it's an expression of the Chinese like whatever custom or value system. And the third thing I want to mention is the relationship between history and philosophy. Just very briefly, it seems like the second quote says that history is essentially the accumulation of data or materials through which the spirit comes to know itself. And for historians and for philosophers like Hegel, history is philosophy worthy or philosophically relevant only as kind of data, because through examining how the world's history or the world spirit progressed in historical in different place and time, by tracing its like kind of footprint, we can better understand the relationship between, let's say, world spirit and individual passions. It's not to the inspiration of fertilization does not go the other way necessarily, that there is still kind of a hierarchy of knowledge or approach towards understanding or consciousness, self-understanding here, like history kind of serves philosophy. So these are my 3 points, and we can carry on.
Yeah. So these are all very interesting. I just want to say something to the last point, because we're going to talk about that kind of unity of a spirit later. Is that I think I definitely agree with you that there is a hierarchy here, meaning that uh, history for Hegel is not changing the truth, right? History might help the truth to come out. And in that sense, history doesn't change anything about human nature, which philosophy can discover on its own.
Right.
But history definitely makes it possible for philosophers to even exist, to even ponder that question, and in the best case scenario, to live as self-conscious agents, right? So because of that, I think for Hegel, history is more than data, in the sense that his history is actually the enabling ground in which the truth of human nature could grow. It's like a fertile ground. But it is data in the sense that we are now in the position of knowing what human nature is. And now we can go back and look at history as kind of like data points of how good we were doing when it comes to human nature in India, right? And where we were in like actualizing human nature in ancient India. And I think in that sense, it is data, but it's also a little bit more effective than just random data, in the sense that it is only within the specific historical shapes that philosophy becomes possible, and only within very specific historical shapes that actuality of human nature becomes possible. And in that sense, it's all history's making, right? But it's all history's making insofar as matching a concept, right? History is not concept creating. History is concept actualizing, right? And in that sense, it becomes relativized to philosophy.
Yes, let me just very briefly respond, and we can definitely elaborate and revisit this conversation in the critical remarks. I think that's a great question. It's a question I'm not entirely clear. So if listeners, you have an idea, or you have an idea, feel free to let me know. I'm not entirely sure what Hegel has in mind when he used the term history is, and the relationship between historical narratives, historical records, or what we call historiography proper, and historical achievement, which translates to the like social institutions that are of Hegel's time, which enable him to like have this retrospective synthetic understanding of. It's rather because the second quote is that it's a record of the such process of self-understanding. So I'm not entirely sure whether he has in mind if world spirit is a person walking, and the history for him, is it the footprint, or is it the footprint plus the whole walking, the facts that it walked across such places? And I think there's certain ambiguity we can, it's more like a hermeneutic, but I think the major points we agree that history is not a concept maker at the same sense as, I don't know, it does not it itself is not a transformative factor, but it records or it makes it explicit to us in retrospect that certain transformative moments took place in world history. So let's
Yeah.
carry on.
Yeah. Very, very briefly to that. I
Yeah.
think the image of a person walking and a footprint on the ground is a good one. I think, to me, history for Hegel is not only the footprint but the ground,
Okay.
right? You cannot walk in absence, in vacuum,
Yes.
right? Um, but how, like, and you don't know your pattern of walking, you don't know where you're going, you
Right.
don't know this, how you're reacting to the ground. uh but yeah, I think there is a little bit more substance than just being a footprint. It's, I think, that kind of a condition that makes this into a reality. But we can definitely revisit this when we are doing the critical assessment. Now, well, we touched upon this in the last episode, but it is important to kind of recognize how Hegel, so what we discussed last time was the difference between human animality and other animals' animality, right? And how Hegel thinks about some sort of a transformation there. And this transformation in Hegel is the kind of the change that happens between nature and Geist, or spirit, right? And I think the listeners are familiar with the term, but just to refresh the memory, when we think about a spirit here, we're thinking more like when we use like something like the term of national spirit, right? We're not thinking about anything, ghostly or transcendent of that kind. It's just like that kind of a sensation. Um, and for Hegel, nature and Geist, there is a connection, there is a continuity, but again, there is a transformation, right? There is a transformation there, and definitely what happens in Geist, in this space of human mindedness in the broadest sense possible. Um, what happens in the space of Geist is its own thing, and there are important differences that he thinks exist between the two realms, um, and it is very interesting that these points about the difference between nature and Geist um, kind of start revolving around uh, repetition. And repetition is a concept that's going to become important for, Hegel critiques like Deleuze later on. But for Hegel, there is something unmoving about nature, that nature, as if nature doesn't have any memory, or nature is not really reacting to anything like a memory, uh, that it just keeps producing what it was produced. He writes, in nature, there is nothing new under the sun, and in this respect, its manifold play of forms produces an effect of boredom. Only in those changes which take place in the spiritual sphere does anything new emerge, right? And he also mentions about the nature of species. The survival of the species, he writes, consists purely in a uniform repetition and one of the same mode of existence. But with spiritual forms, it is otherwise. For in this case, change occurs not just on the surface, but within the concept. And it is the concept itself which is modified. In the natural world, the species does not progress, but in the world of the spirit, each change is a form of progress. I mean, there are many things that we can say about this, and of course, the general tension between Hegel's uh, approach and the discoveries of modern biology. That's its own thing. Um, but it is also interesting and to me to think about this in the context of Hegel's science of logic, right? And in Hegel's science of logic, the beginning of it, we have this like explosion of concepts, and one of the things that happens is that uh, change becomes fundamental to any something, and also like like change by others and internal change and all of that becomes essential. And we haven't like finished reading Hegel's Sense of Logic. At some point, the nature and the spirit show up. I wonder how these two are gonna work out. If there is no genuine change in nature, what is the change in nature? And what is the difference between these kind of levels of change? And not only that, but also in what sense there's nothing new under the sun in nature? Because this doesn't need to be about the continuity of evolution or anything like that. And that's, I think, something that Gilles Deleuze, for instance, emphasizes on, which is every leaf is different from another leaf. And that's not something that Hegel needed, evolution to recognize, right? Every lion is different from the next lion. And why that change is not recognized as a change? I mean, one aspect of this I totally understand of what type of a change that Hegel is implying here, which is that lions do not have history in the sense that they're not building upon some Lionese enterprise in which like something like culture in the human form is getting developed or changed or transformed, right? As soon as the new lion is born, it is the same old story of lions. There are different things, like this lion is going to hunt a very different animal. This lion is going to have a very different temperament. This lion is going to be, maybe forced to migrate to a place that its ancestors did not have to do. But the lion is the lion. The lion is not going to change this kind of lion aspects of itself. Um, but humanity can. Humanity could become, there are no ascetics amongst lions. There are ascetics among human beings. And like that kind of like reaction to nature creates a door of difference, that type of a change, that kind of a difference is not accessible to other animals. So I'm not denying that there is a possibility for change and difference within humanity, that type of a change and difference is not available to lions. But that doesn't mean there is nothing new under the sun in nature, or the changes in nature do not matter. Needless to say, species do change. And that's important to know that Hegel thinks they don't, right? The fact that the species go through change expands the continuity and the leap between animality and human animality, animality of other animals and humanity of human animals, doesn't sound as justified. But this is something that we can talk about in the critical remarks. Trent.
Yes, it's just some very wild thought to some extent, inspired by what you just said. Yes, I totally agree. The change difference thing, at least in Hegel science logic, applies to all forms of being, not exclusive to human beings. And so what his justification in like locating this novelty exclusively in the spiritual realm? What I have a hunch. I cannot help but wonder whether this is a case of methodology inspired ontology. I don't know what I'm saying. Is I think by end of like 18th century, early 19th century, we already had a certain kind of paradigm like research methods pertaining to, say, comparative botany or like a zoology. So of course you can go out and see new plants when you discover new territory, or even the climate changes endemic to the plants that would take a different shape. But the way you repeat the data collection and evaluation process, that natural law does not change accordingly. However, I think that Hegel would argue that for cultural interpretation or historical analysis, that the historical method itself, the type of philosophical history Hegel was doing, was not possible, say, in like ancient Greek or ancient Rome. Therefore, like the passages, the walking of all the spirit or the history proper itself changes the methodology through which human individuals that have come to grapple with the history or come to understand world spirit. So that in that sense, they're new of different category. It doesn't mean I agree with him, but I think this is at his time there are probably different methods like biblical literature, hermeneutics, textual criticism definitely followed a way more flexible, less natural law like methods, which was applied to botany and zoology of his time. I wonder whether this is a case that that difference, qualitative difference in methods of understanding, influenced his judgment about the subject matter itself. Because the natural science has this different, perhaps more permanent, more robust method. Hence, the object of examination, namely the nature itself or the environment itself, is less, it does not develop to the same level or in a quantum leap as like with culture. That's my take.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And yeah, I think it's thinking about how natural law functions in response to nature. And I think like Hegel has like a the idea of that kind of a mechanistic version of natural law, and that type of a natural law doesn't seem to be applicable to a human culture, and that creates something that is not repetition in the same way. And I think this also is about the fact that although of course like the newborn lion is in some ways a response to the ancestors, right? Like everything that the ancestors have done now kind of reveals itself in that person. But I think it's different from like something like cultural identity or the enterprise of knowledge throughout history. That of course, like if you think about the two different lines, right? We're doing exactly what other animals do, meaning that we're genetically responding to the past all the time, right? But we're also responding to cultural identities of the past. We're also responding to the knowledge that has been the continuum of knowledge that is passed upon us. We're responding to memory in a very different way. Even the stones have basic memory in the sense that in their shape, they remember what the time was. But that's different from, a turtle's memory, and it's different from a human memory, and it's different from a human society's memory. And I think that's the kind of another layer of this continuum. What is surprising is that Hegel thinks that there is that his language is very radical when it comes to change. He's really eager to not put us in continuum with other animals, right? And I think that's something that is important, that he's really trying not to do that. And I think that's something that is worth mentioning. So another layer of this point about like this kind of a geistic space is that we're all in it, right? Insofar as a human being, according to Hegel, you are more or less to a degree representing human nature, and you cannot represent human nature without being part of this game, the geistig game, right? The game of spirit. And But the next question, and again, this is not how the book itself is organized, it's just like this is how it made sense to us, is that okay, if you're thinking about that, now what are the units of this geistig space, right? And this is particularly relevant when we are thinking about history, right? If we want to say that proper history only is available to minded animals, meaning that animals who are in the space of spirit, in the spiritual space, then how should we deal with like how their quote unquote progress, right? And one thing is to just like, okay, this is just humanity. We're all the same part of the same story. And the only meaningful history is some kind of a, you know, abstracting from all these random differences that we have made between religion and nation and all of that, and think about humanity as this kind of a one rhythm, right? That's the thing, that's the point, and all the other differences are the differences that do not matter, right? And I think that's, as in general, it is important question: which differences matter, right? And we said that in terms of human nature, that definitely there are some differences between human beings that Hegel thinks doesn't matter. Some differences he thinks it matters, right? And the same question is relevant when it comes to the subcategorization of differences in humanity. In what way the differences within the general geistlichness of humanity matters. And we haven't put the quotes here, but it's good to have that, and Trent mentioned it briefly, that for Hegel, humanity start creating different states within itself. And every state is not about just a kind of a bureaucratic class that rules, but it's about a lot of other things. And there's some elements about that we're going to talk more about, for instance, the influence of religion. But what matters is, in Hegel's view, is that the state creates some sort of a self-enclosed entity. And Hegel is very keen on using the analogy of organism, right? That any state becomes this kind of an self-enclosed entity in which it has its own internal rhythm. So the interiority is very important, that within history, these self-enclosed entities started to emerge. Now, you know, if you ask Hegel why we didn't just start having one state and one principle, I'm not sure what would be his response of like, what are the contingencies of whether this is contingent or this is necessary, right? I think he thinks there is something necessary about that, but I'm not sure about the argument for that. But in any case, this kind of a state-based distinction means that we now have some things that we can think about as a nation, right? And when we have something like nation, we have principles, we have ideas, we have customs, we have self-understanding, we have religion, we have all of those things. And these nations become important. What is important here, though, is that in spite of the fact that, actually, let me read the last quote because I think it's important. There's one side of the story. On the one hand, Hegel says something like this: insofar as they are nations, their principles are natural ones. And since their principles differ, the nations themselves are also naturally different. Each has its own principle, which it seeks to realize as its ends. If it has attained this end, it has no further task to perform in the world. So for Hegel, this kind of self-enclosed entities just like organisms, they have their own agenda, and they're doing that, and they might fulfill it. Sometimes when they fulfill it, they actually disintegrate, and the fulfillment is their disintegration, right? Now, with this language, you would think that, okay, so Mongolia has its own story, India has its own story, France has its own story, and that's it. Now we can think about how these are self-enclosed, how they are different, but there is some level of isolation there in terms of like principles and standards, especially in terms of values. But then Hegel says something quite different. In 53, he says, the particular spirit of a particular nation may perish, but it is a link in the chain of the world's spirit's development, and this universal spirit cannot perish. Right? And here the image that we have is that although these are all we have is this kind of self-enclosed nations with their history and memory and values and all of that, and they show up, they emerge, they pop up, they get developed, and they disappear. They don't just disappear completely. They are part of this whole general flow that exists, that he calls universal spirit. And for those of you who are familiar with the finitude infinity discussion in Hegel's Science of Logic, and we have episodes on that, this is very much like parallel to that to me, which is for Hegel. Hegel gets to a point that he says that, okay, finite beings is like what exists, and then he says, okay, there's finite beings, and then the finite beings by definition die, and then the next finite being emerges, and the next finite being emerges, this next finite being emerges, and infinity is not something that transcends this chain of finitude. It is the chain itself, right? It is the development from one to the other. This, of course, when it's applied to spirit in this way, implies some level of continuity, right? And it is interesting that in Hegel's view, it seems like that there are not multiple chains. It's not like that Mongolia, China, Southern Russia, and like Korea are part of the same chain. And these are like nations pop up within them, states pop up within them, collapse, and then new things come up. But they're all part of this chain that includes this geographical places, right? Which, by the way, could be exactly the same place, like China, right? You could say that, okay, here's the chain. There are finite states that come and go. Here's the chain that we call China, right? Hegel, I think, agrees that you can have this for China, you can have this for that geographical location, but there is a discontinuity. That chain gets connected to the Central Asia's chain. That Central Asia's chain gets related to Iran's chain, then to Ottomans, and then to Romans, and then to the modern France. So this kind of a chain of finitude of self-enclosed states with their own principles and values is inevitably related to that basic chain, which I think it's only possible if you have two assumptions. Number one, there is a common human nature called self-conscious agency. Number two, culture is inherently non-transformative in a fundamental sense. There is no cultural development that creates a new chain that still coming from the branch of Homo sapiens, but it's its own chain. Its task is not the same as the other. No. For Hegel, cultures are very important. Cultures become, in some ways, incommensurable. Cultures sometimes become self-enclosed. Cultures become very art-prone, like you cannot just go judge them morally, all of that. But no culture gets the, um, permission to be outside universalist spirit in the positive way. By that I mean that Hegel thinks, as we're going to see later, that there are shapes of human community that do not qualify to be part of history because of other reasons. They don't have records, whatever. But I'm talking about a culture that qualifies as a nation in the Hegelian sense, right? But may not be part of the universalist spirit for other reasons than just lacking in basic resources. I think that's something interesting that we can talk about later on. Trent?
Yes, I'm just gathering my thought because you gave us a lot of really interesting ideas, and particularly like the parallel you gave between finite beings through their like rise and fall, some continuity or the concept of infinity comes to be, and this different cultures or states that rise and fall eventually contributed to the world spirits of the continuity. And I agree with you, like the two assumptions that are definitely there to enable Hegel to essentialize culture and then put them into a hierarchically ordered chronology that you've after fulfilling this task, this nations, like what the historical mission has already completed, then the world spirit moves to a different place. And so yes, I'm just very curious about the fact that he says certain national spirits that could perish, but the world would not. And I just wondered what are the conditions and like perhaps necessity for an culture to die, basically. Because I'm thinking of like Max Weber, he also maintains that certain value systems, say Confucianism, which works for Imperial China, could disappear, and it did. But Weber's rationality is different because is when this system no longer makes sense to the social situation which evolved. And for Hegel, I'm not entirely clear whether it's kind of internal demise or it's just become death. He means like kind of philosophically irrelevant. You see what I'm saying? So that nation's spirit perishes because of our attention, because we have a specific goal to trace the development of freedom or like how will the spirit becomes fully aware of itself. We must leave that place, therefore that spirit dies, even though it may have already grown into a different form, a form to fulfill needs of their like social relationships, but it becomes irrelevant and uninteresting for us. I'm not entirely sure because for Weber, it's definitely not that values that would just like automatically disappear once it reached a certain cultural achievements. Okay, that's all I have to
Yeah,
say.
I think the point about death, which is very interesting that you brought it up. I think there are both terms in Hegel. I think they are relevant, meaning that I think if you ask Hegel, he would say that insofar as the grand contribution of the Greeks to world history, in terms of like kind of opening up ways to articulate human nature, not only in thought but in institutions, there is a point in ancient Greece that this just stops. That it doesn't. That contribution is dead. In that sense, we get into some form of repetition, that is just a repetition that is philosophically irrelevant. That just like it ends. So I'm sure that Hegel would think about, like, even not, if not dead, some sort of coma, right? Nations go to coma in different periods insofar as their contribution to the articulation of human nature goes, right? And I think he thinks we have committees, nations that they have been in a coma for millennials. And when we talk about China and India next time, that becomes clear that he thinks I don't think he thinks they're dead. I think he thinks they're in coma when it comes to articulating human nature. But I think there's another level of this that I think here he's thinking about that more than the other, is that just some nations kind of fulfill something, and because they're fulfilled, um, they feel they become irrelevant and they collapse, right? Just like um, this is a little bit tangential, but I think it's relevant. I had a student once that told me the story of, I believe it was his dad, that his dad was always kind of like being there and fulfilling tasks for the growth of children. So he had a very specific type of like principles for action, what needs to be done, and how he can contribute to their like maturing up, right? There was a point in time that the kids grew up, and all of those tasks that he had set for himself seemed fulfilled. And in this specific story, this a friend of mine said that he kind of immediately started falling ill and rather also depressed and passed away. And to him, it was like that he didn't have anything else. What he set for himself as a positive contribution, it was over. And I think there is something about individual human beings that also reflects that sometimes we fulfill that, and then our motivation for continuation start to evaporate. I think there is something about nations like that, at least in Hegel's work and Hegel's thought. Yes. So the last thing that we want to touch upon in this episode is the point about it's a point that is actually very minor, in some ways very minor in the reason in history, and we don't have like lengthy quotes here, but it is about the relation between nations and religion, and the state and religion. And I think in a very interesting way, this actually has been the part of reading reason and history that has occupied my mind more than anything else. Like this kind of understanding of religion as kind of a founding principle of a state, and also like in different ways how religion, when it's thought in like as something different than like set of rules, right, or a very kind of obviously religious state. When we take away that part and think about religion a little bit more in depth, it is very interesting because Hegel thinks, he says, each particular state has emerged from its own particular religion, right? And he says it is in terms of religion that a nation defines what it considers to be true. So for Hegel, to me, religion must be some very basic like chain, like causal chain almost, that this leads to that, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense, this connects with that but not connects with this other thing. And all of those kind of like quote unquote causal chains are not causal chains in a scientific way that are just descriptive, but it's about practical matters, that if you do this, this will happen. If you celebrate someone's birthday sooner than their actual birthday, something bad will happen, right? Or you say that don't treat this person in this way, it will come back to you. Like even things as simple as that, some sort of convictions about a causal chain that has a practical relevance. And it also kind of presents itself, exhibits itself in all sorts of rituals. That in the most anti-religious country, in the most secular country, if you think about those types of convictions and rituals and customs, they definitely exist. And I think that's very interesting to think about religion in that way, instead of religion in terms of a very, you know, just like a set of rule, kind of a legalist version of religion, perhaps. Yeah, and I wonder. This is the last thing I'm going to say, and then Trent, it's all yours. Is that I think it's very interesting that to think about that if Hegel has a point about the religious foundation of the state, then what is secularization, right? Because I am very much opposed of this rather shallow defense from um, religious people against atheism, to say that, oh, like atheism is just another religion, right? Like that seems very shallow to me, to think about atheism as just another religion in that way, meaning that I think there is a fundamental difference between a state that is dogmatically enforcing one interpretation of a single religion to its citizens than France, right? But the secular version of the state, example being, let's say, France or the US, or even like France is a good example because it's less religious in the usual way than a place like US, like statistically speaking. Do we need a religion to have a modern state? I think that's basically my question, right? Is the modern state in need of a religion the same as any other state in need of a religion? And I think Hegel's answers to that is yes. I think he thinks that modern state, with its appreciation of human subjectivity, everything that feels like being very much maybe anti-religious or anti-dogmatism in general, is contingent upon a very specific interpretation of Christianity as it presents itself in the customs and habits of a society. Then people may not know even that they are Christian in that fashion. It is just emanating from the customs and habits and early childhood education, all of that very basic conviction. And only with that this state could survive. And in that sense, a quote unquote progressive revolution in, let's say, a Middle Eastern country that is dominated by dogmatic religion shouldn't be framed as getting rid of religion. It should be, the question shouldn't be that how do we get rid of religion in the state matters. The question is what type of a religion will give us so and so. And that's a very different way of thinking. And I think that's something that has really bugged me in the positive way after I finished reading the text. Trent, you are the expert here.
No,
Tell
I'm
us
not the
more.
expert. I really enjoy what you said, like the points on secularization, as well as instead of asking how to get rid of a religion for a specific, but rather ask what kind of religiosity will be more conducive to what we want to achieve in a certain society. Those are really brilliant points. I need more time to digest those, but I'll give my take on Hegel's place for religion here tentatively. I'm fascinated by Hegel's relationship with religion and how does he define. First, to respond to your point, I agree that he definitely believes certain forms of religion are necessary for world spirit to achieve what it really is destined to obtain, namely to be fully conscious of itself. Like Christianity for him has a world historical purpose. There's virtually no way out. Basically, it's without it, you would not get into a fully modern state, and all citizens cannot all be equal or free without it. But on the other hand, religion, at least in his other set of lectures, what the religions it's kind of the parallel image of a nation, which fits really well here. Like, for instance, religion of China, religion of India, they worked so well for the state so that the nation stagnated, more or less. They're forever trapped in a kind of non-historical, or at least at best, at the first stage of patriarchal family absorbing everything sort of thing, like religion and nation are achieving the same goal. So there is a certain nuance or disagreement there. On one hand, religion could be something not specific to any nation. In the case of Christianity, is to bring about what world spirit or human nature is truly about. On the other hand, you also have nation-specific religions. And the third thing I tend to think, like, this is what I thought, there's definitely not enough substantial evidence in reason and history to back it up, but I'm tempted to interpret it that way, is could we say, like, to a certain extent or in certain context, religion is the Zolan art of the national spirit? That makes sense for the concept of sacred, which means you set something apart so that, like, could be a symbol, be a like story, be a book, so that a society would restructure itself, say, periodically, with that as a reference to keep itself on track. And that I was reading your magnum opus the other day, that like on concrete universals, well, definitely circulated that link once it is published, as you introduced a very interesting approach towards the relationship between universal and individual, which we already talked about in this series from the very beginning, is the homoaesthetic property cluster theory. And I think, like, Hegel's very nuanced approach towards religion and its relation with states could potentially provide a material, at least, for that specific theory, meaning that those sacred symbols, stuff set apart, the mirror image of nation, the Zolan of a nation, are the self-consciously introduced mechanism to limit or to foster certain bias to probability distribution, so that that culture or that nation could evolve. It's still open-ended. It's not destined or written, but it's not completely chaotic either. So it could achieve a certain point that it is like something grows and changes, but still remains the same. There's certain identity across time and history for us. That, oh, that's Imperial China, even though, like, we're talking about two moments over 2,000 years apart, because that self-regulating mechanism is so powerful to the extent that, per Hegel's judgment, the whole value system or the whole whatever stagnated, or religion stagnated. So I think there are a lot of potential here, and of course, this reason in history is not the best place to uncover Hegel's ideas about religion, because he has specific writings on religion out there. So, but those are tentative thoughts. I think there are a lot of, like, potentials in it.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting in terms of, like, thinking about religion, first of all, as something that is not fully aligned with nation, but it kind of keeps it in check, maybe. Like, the gap between them is always kind of like, just, it's a continuous in continuous existence. And also religion in the sense of, like, cultural constraints that create control of the probability of certain traits or even identities appearing in this culture as opposed to another culture. Like, there is a, like, that kind of constraint. It's not just about a legal constraint, it's about all sorts of constraints in terms of what is sacred, what is not, what is open, what is not, what is explorable and what is not, and what is even thinkable and what is not. And all of those kind of, like, specifics create a pattern of a probability distribution of what kind of identities and uh, yeah, even conversations are possible within a nation as opposed to another one. And yeah, it is interesting though that I think with the same kind of an idea, Hegel would think that sure, there are different religions, sure, these different religions are creating these kind of different patterns of possibilities for identities, possibilities for expressions, uh, but that doesn't mean that these are just, horizontally a lot. Like just there is the Mongolian version of this, there's the imperial China version of this. There is the Ethiopian Empire's version of this. It's not a horizontal. There's again a hierarchy, and that's I think it's very much understandable from recent history even that for Hegel there is something about Protestant Christianity that makes it a better religion than not only Catholicism, but every other religion that he discusses. And he is he's like it's interesting to see that how all of these things kind of get back to that very basic point about human nature, that hierarchy of religion, indifferent to the fact that every nation is dependent on a certain religion, comes into view if you realize what is human nature and the translation of the in itself of humanity to the for itself of humanity, the potential into an actual, which religion is conducive to that goal. And that's basically what I meant by like what is the proper religion for a modern state?
Right.
Because that's a much less ambitious, in some ways, claim than what Hegel thinks. Because we can disregard Hegel's point that this is the only chain, this is the only goal. We can disregard all of that, but keep something conditional in place, right? If modern state is what we want, what is the proper religion for it? I don't think these two, first of all, I don't think this question is going to be impacted by a lot of things that we might be critical of Hegel. That question itself is something that could be asked. And I think it's that's not how progressive movements usually think about this from my understanding, is from my personal understanding from the case of Iran. That's definitely not the ambition, the concrete ambition that a religious change must come in place. It's more about how do we get rid of religion. And I think it's a very interesting thing that how Hegel kind of like ties up the two, that you cannot answer one without answering the others. Every secular state is contingent upon a religious conviction. That religious conviction has nothing to do with believing in a transcendent God. It's a completely different type of a thing. All right, I think we have talked enough about history and philosophy and the minimal components of human spirit and how it presents itself in human history. What we're going to do in the next episode is to start talking about history more directly. And we're actually going to start with saying, according to Hegel, who doesn't belong to history? Who doesn't belong to philosophically relevant history? Or who belongs to the philosophically relevant history, but after an initial contribution, they're nothing but a nation in common. With that, we can end this episode.
Dear listeners, thanks for listening. Stay attuned. Reason in History Part 3 is coming up.